My parents gave my sister's daughter a trip to Paris with first-class tickets. My mom said, "She deserves culture, you'd just waste it." I got a postcard that said Bon Voyage. When my art went viral, my dad just stared and whispered, "How?" Last year during dinner, my mom casually said to me, while cutting into her steak, "Lydia deserves culture. You'd just waste it." She was talking about my niece, who my parents were sending on a first-class trip to Paris for her 12th birthday. Me? They handed me a tacky postcard that said Bon Voyage. I never really said anything to them. I just took it. Fast forward, my art went viral. Gallery showings. Six-figure commissions. Recognition. When my dad wandered into my studio months later, he just stared at a painting and whispered under his breath, "How?" And honestly, I didn't have the heart to tell him exactly how much he'd underestimated me. I never expected anything different that night. We were at the old family house in Charleston, the place where everything always felt just a little too formal, a little too staged, like a life meant for a photo album, not for real people. The dining room smelled like roast beef and expensive candles. Lydia was seated between my parents, giggling over something on her phone. Bianca was dabbing her mouth with a cloth napkin, her wedding rings clinking against her wine glass whenever she moved. I sat at the end of the table, like an afterthought. Dinner had barely started when my mom, Judith, dropped the news like it was nothing. "We've decided to send Lydia to Paris this summer," she said, slicing her steak neatly, like she was performing surgery. "First class, of course," my dad added, smiling in that stiff way he always did when money was involved. I managed a polite smile. "Wow, that's amazing. She'll have a great time." Judith barely glanced at me as she said it, "She deserves to see culture. You'd just waste it." No hesitation. No pause to consider how that might land. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was just a fact, in their world. I bit into a dry piece of bread and swallowed hard. Lydia squealed when they gave her the itinerary, printed and laminated like some school project. Bianca beamed like she was accepting an award. Then came the kicker, a bright, gaudy postcard handed across the table. The front was a cartoonish drawing of the Eiffel Tower, complete with hearts and glittery stars. Across the top, in swirly font, Bon Voyage. Inside, my mom had written, "Keep creating your little paintings. Love, Mom and Dad." Not even a joke. Just a tidy little dismissal. I excused myself early that night. Blamed work. Drove back to my tiny studio apartment where the pipes clanked and the air conditioning rattled. I sat on the floor for a long time, staring at that postcard, wondering why it still hurt. I was 26 years old. Too old to expect anything different. But there's something about being unseen by the people who raised you. It doesn't matter how old you are, it always cuts the same way. For the next few months, I buried myself in my art. Watercolor landscapes. Charcoal portraits. Abstract pieces that didn't fit into neat boxes. I worked nights at a coffee shop, mornings at an art supply store. Every spare minute went into painting. I didn't think about success. I didn't think about revenge. I just painted because I didn't know what else to do. One sticky July afternoon, I posted some of my work online. A friend had told me to create an Instagram page just to get my work out there. I didn't expect much. Maybe a few likes. A comment or two from friends. I woke up the next morning to 1,000 notifications. Art blogs were reposting my work. People were sharing my paintings, writing long captions about how they reminded them of home, or their grandmother's porch, or summers they thought they'd forgotten. Offers started trickling in: commissions, gallery shows, interviews. At first I thought it was a scam. It wasn't. Within a year, I had moved into a proper studio downtown, still small, but with real windows and actual heating. I wasn't rich by any means, but I wasn't counting quarters for gas anymore either. I didn't tell my parents. Why would I? They hadn't asked. In their world, if it wasn't a degree, a title, a wedding, or a baby, it didn't count. Then one evening, everything collided. I was at Le Farfalle, a chic little Italian place downtown, having dinner with Marisol, an old college friend who had always believed in my work even when nobody else did. We were laughing over a second glass of wine when I saw them, my parents, Bianca, Lydia sitting 2 tables away. Of course, they didn't notice me at first. Until the manager came over. A bottle of champagne in hand. "Congratulations, Ms. Marlowe," he said, beaming, setting the bottle down with a flourish. "On your incredible success." Heads turned. My parents turned. My mom's smile froze, the way a lake freezes just before the ice cracks. My dad's mouth tightened. Bianca's fork clattered onto her plate. I mumbled a polite thank you, cheeks burning. I wanted to crawl under the table. But Marisol squeezed my hand under the table. "You earned this," she whispered. I kept my head down the rest of the dinner. Didn't look over once. When we finished, Marisol and I slipped out before dessert. I thought that was it. I didn't expect my dad to show up at my studio 2 days later. I was setting up for a small open studio event when I heard the door creak open. There he was standing awkwardly, a paper coffee cup in his hand, as if it were some kind of peace offering. He didn't say much. Just wandered around, looking at the paintings. He stopped in front of one, a large canvas of a little girl in a yellow dress, standing alone at the edge of the marsh at sunset. I heard him inhale sharply, almost like he was about to say something. But all that came out was a whisper. How? How had I made something like that? How had I turned into something he couldn't understand? I didn't answer. What could I have said? By painting through the years you ignored me? By surviving the small cuts that added up to 1,000 invisible scars? He didn't stay long. He left the coffee on a table and mumbled something about seeing me around. I stood there long after he left, watching the marsh sunset fade to night outside my real studio windows, realizing for the first time that I didn't need their permission to be who I was. But the thing about family, about old wounds, is they don't just heal because you succeed. They don't vanish because strangers love you. You still carry the scar tissue around. You just learn how to live with it. After that day, things shifted, but not in any dramatic, storybook way. My dad didn't suddenly become proud. My mom didn't suddenly start introducing me as her daughter the artist at cocktail parties. If anything, they seemed a little unsure around me. Like I was a stranger they were trying to remember. It started with small things. An email from my mom, forwarded to me by mistake, asking Bianca if she knew how serious my art thing really was. A Facebook friend request from my dad, which I left sitting unanswered for weeks because I didn't know what the heck to do with it. At family dinners, the few I attended, there was a strange new edge to conversations. Judith would mention Paris or Lydia's piano recitals or Charles's promotion, her voice overly bright, while sneaking glances at me like she was waiting for me to offer up something equally impressive. I didn't. I talked about the weather. About how humid Charleston had been that month. About how the magnolia trees were blooming early. I didn't owe them my success story. Still, sometimes against my better judgment, I caught myself craving it. Their approval. Their pride. Their acceptance. It's one thing to tell yourself you don't care. It's another to sit across the table from your family and feel like an alien among your own blood. Lydia, bless her, was the only one who didn't seem weird about it. She'd started texting me occasionally, usually random things like pictures of her sketches or links to artists she liked on TikTok. She was getting into art, too, it turned out. One afternoon, she sent me a picture of a lopsided cat she'd drawn and captioned it, "LOL, it's not good, but I tried." Faced with tears of joy, I stared at it for a long time. I remembered being her age. Drawing horses in the margins of my school notebooks. Showing them to my mom, desperate for a crumb of encouragement, only to have her say something like, "Horses don't look like that, Vanessa. Maybe you should focus more on your math homework." I texted Lydia back, "It's adorable. Keep going. Art gets better the more you practice. I'm proud of you." Simple words. Maybe nothing. But maybe everything, too. A few weeks later, Bianca called me out of the blue. I almost didn't answer. The last time she called was to ask if I could babysit Lydia during a charity gala. But something told me to pick up. "Hey," she said, voice oddly formal. "Lydia's school is doing a parent-student art night. She asked if you could come with her." Not Bianca. Me. I blinked. "Yeah," I said, after a beat. "Of course." The night of the event, I wore jeans and a loose sweater and showed up at the school gym, which smelled like popcorn and floor wax. Kids' paintings hung everywhere: dinosaurs, spaceships, portraits of lopsided families. Lydia ran up to me, beaming, dragging me toward a table stacked with paints and paper. She introduced me to her friends. "This is my Aunt Vanessa. She's a real artist." The other kids' eyes widened. One of them actually whispered, "Whoa." It was the first time in my life I'd ever been introduced that way, not as Bianca's sister. Not as the odd one. As something good. We spent the evening painting silly murals on butcher paper: a rainbow here, a dragon there. Lydia's dragon ended up looking more like a lumpy iguana, but she loved it. And for a few hours, I forgot about the postcard. About the wasted years. About the weight of never being enough. It wasn't all gone, of course. Trauma doesn't evaporate under fluorescent gym lights. But something softened. Bianca even approached me before we left, fiddling with her car keys. "Hey," she said, awkward. "Thanks for coming." It meant a lot to her. To me too. I nodded. Didn't push it. Didn't need to. Small steps. Later that week, my parents sent me an invitation to a family gathering at their country club. Some charity auction dinner. Dress code, formal. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to delete the email and forget it. Part of me, the old, raw part, wanted to show up, dressed to the nines, arm in arm with success, just to shove it in their faces. Neither felt right. In the end, I decided to go. Not for them. For myself. If I had learned anything this past year, it was that you don't heal by hiding forever. Sometimes, you show up just to prove to yourself that you can. The night of the event, Charleston was buzzing with late spring warmth. I wore a sleek navy dress that made me feel like I belonged anywhere I chose to be. My hair was pinned up, a few curls escaping, not perfect, but mine. When I walked into the country club's grand hall, I saw them instantly. Judith, in a silver gown, surrounded by friends, laughing too loudly. Richard, clutching a whiskey, nodding politely. Bianca, chatting with Charles near the silent auction tables. Nobody saw me yet. I stood there for a minute, taking it all in: the chandeliers, the polished wood floors, the low hum of old money conversations. I realized, standing there, that I wasn't afraid. I didn't need them to see me. I saw myself, and that was enough. Still, when my mom finally spotted me and her eyes widened, not in disapproval, not even quite in surprise, but in something I couldn't name yet, I couldn't help the flicker of something deep inside me. Not triumph. Not revenge. Something quieter. Maybe closure. Or maybe the beginning of it. Judith made her way over, glass of champagne in hand. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor. "Vanessa," she said, breathless. "You look wonderful." I nodded, polite, non-committal. She hesitated, then smiled a little too wide. "We're so proud of all you've accomplished." I said thank you. Because it was the easiest thing to say. Because maybe she meant it, in her own strange, late way. As the night went on, I mingled with a few acquaintances, exchanged polite nods with people who didn't know what to make of me. At one point, Bianca and Lydia waved me over to admire a painting being auctioned: a boring still life of lemons and wine bottles. Lydia leaned close and whispered, "Yours are way better." I laughed quietly and squeezed her hand. It wasn't everything. It wasn't a storybook ending. But it was something. Something real. Something mine. After the charity auction, the distance between my parents and me stayed, but it wasn't the same sharp, cutting distance as before. It was more like two people standing on opposite sides of a river, waving awkwardly, pretending the water wasn't there. A week or so after the event, my dad called me. Not a text. Not an email. A real phone call. I almost didn't answer. My thumb hovered over the decline button, but some stubborn part of me pressed accept at the last second. "Hey," he said, voice gruff like he wasn't used to forming the word. "Hi, Dad." Silence stretched out between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I thought maybe you'd want to have lunch sometime," he said finally, like it physically hurt him to offer. "Sure," I said, because why not? We met at a seafood place near Shem Creek, the kind of spot that served oysters on ice and had boats bobbing in the water out the windows. He was already seated when I got there, tapping his fingers against the table like he was nervous. We made small talk at first: weather, parking, the tourist crowds downtown. It felt stiff, like trying to dance with someone who kept stepping on your toes. Then, over a plate of shrimp and grits, he cleared his throat. "I saw some of your paintings," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "They're real good." It was almost funny, the way he said it, like a mechanic telling someone their car was running fine. I thanked him. Because it was easier than asking why it took him 30 years to say something kind. He fiddled with his water glass, leaving smudged fingerprints behind. "Your mother, she has a hard time with things she can't control," he said, like it explained everything. "She always wanted you girls to have the best." I smiled thinly. "Sometimes the best isn't what you think it is," I said. He nodded, looking older than I remembered, like time had folded him in. "I know that now," he said. Another pause. Then, more quietly, "I'm sorry we didn't see it before." I didn't know what to say to that. Sorry? For the years of being invisible? For the way they laughed off my dreams like they were childish? But part of me understood. People are limited by their own fears sometimes. And they pass that fear on like a family heirloom. I didn't forgive him, not right then. Forgiveness isn't a light switch. It's a slow, grinding process, like trying to smooth down the jagged edges of broken glass. But maybe I was willing to start trying. After lunch, he insisted on paying the bill. He hugged me awkwardly in the parking lot, like a man who hadn't practiced tenderness in decades. I let him. The next few months passed in a strange kind of limbo. Judith started inviting me to more family events: birthday parties, brunches, even a 4th of July cookout. At first, I made excuses. Work. Deadlines. A gallery opening. Anything to keep a safe distance. But Lydia kept asking. And when she asked, it didn't feel like an obligation. It felt like a bridge. I showed up, sometimes. Not always. And when I did, I made sure to drive myself, stay as long as I felt comfortable, and leave when I needed to. No explanations, no guilt. It was on one of those afternoons, a muggy Sunday in August, that something shifted again. We were gathered in my parents' backyard, the smell of burgers on the grill, cicadas screaming in the trees. I was sitting on a lounge chair, sketching idly in a notebook while Lydia and her friends played in the sprinkler. Judith approached, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. She handed me one and sat down in the chair beside mine, smoothing her linen pants carefully like she was preparing for a performance. "I didn't know you still liked drawing just for fun," she said, glancing at my notebook. I shrugged. "I never stopped." She sipped her tea. Her hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly. "I guess. I thought you'd grow out of it." The words weren't cruel this time. Just tired. Regretful, maybe. I said simply. Judith stared out across the yard, watching Lydia shriek as she ran through the sprinkler. "I never wanted you to struggle," she said. "I thought if we pushed you towards something safer, you'd have an easier life." I let the words hang between us. Let her sit with them. Because I had struggled. And not because of art. Because of them. Because of the constant, grinding message that who I was naturally, fully wasn't enough. She turned to me then, her face open in a way I hadn't seen since I was very small. "I'm sorry, Vanessa." It wasn't a grand apology. It wasn't a complete accounting of all the hurt. But it was more than I ever thought I'd get. I nodded, feeling the lump rise in my throat. And then, because I needed her to understand, I said quietly, "I didn't need easier. I needed you to believe in me." She closed her eyes for a moment, like the weight of that truth hurt. Maybe it did. Maybe it should. The sprinkler sputtered and coughed in the background. Lydia's laughter echoed over the yard. And for the first time, the space between my mother and me didn't feel completely impassable. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a Hallmark movie ending. But it was a start. After a while, we talked about smaller things, recipes, Lydia's art projects, a new gallery show I was preparing for. Judith listened in a way she hadn't before, not pretending to understand, not pretending to approve, but listening. It felt like breathing clean air after years underground. Later that evening, as I was gathering my things to leave, Lydia came bounding over, her hair plastered to her forehead from the sprinkler. "Wait, wait," she cried, digging in a plastic bag. "I made you something." She pulled out a small canvas, a bright, messy, beautiful painting of a girl standing in front of a huge swirling sunset. "It's you," Lydia said proudly. "You're in the painting." I knelt down to hug her, blinking back tears. I wasn't just an afterthought anymore. In some small way, I was the beginning of something new. After that backyard afternoon, something between us stayed, fragile, but different. It wasn't a full repair. Not even close. But it was like someone had finally stopped pretending the cracks weren't there and had started, awkwardly, to run their fingers along the broken places. Over the next few months, I found myself pulled deeper into family things. Not because they demanded it, but because Lydia kept reaching out. Birthday parties, art fairs, school plays where she was a tree or a background fairy and wanted me to sit in the second row so she could see my face when she waved. I never wanted kids of my own, not because I didn't love them, but because I'd never trusted myself to do it right. Not with the kind of blueprint I'd grown up with. But Lydia made it easy. Made it different. Around Halloween, Bianca asked if I could help Lydia with a costume. "She wants to be an artist," Bianca said over the phone, half laughing, half sighing. "I don't know how to make that into a costume." I smiled to myself. "I'll handle it." We spent the afternoon in my studio, piecing together a tiny smock splattered with fabric paint, a toy palette, a beret that sat crooked on Lydia's head and made her look more like a French cartoon than a serious artist. She loved it. She marched around the studio, brandishing a paintbrush like a sword, declaring, "I'm Lydia Van Gogh." I laughed until I couldn't breathe. When I dropped her off at Bianca's later that night, Bianca hugged me, a quick, tight squeeze, awkward but genuine. It was the first hug we'd exchanged in probably a decade. Later, lying in bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling of my tiny studio apartment, I thought about how strange it all was. Not bad. Just strange. The more visible I became in my career, in the art community, even within the family, the more it unsettled old balances that had always tilted one way. I noticed it most with my mom. At first, Judith had seemed proud in a shallow way, the way you might be proud of a niece who won a pie baking contest. But slowly, there was something else underneath it. Something nervous. Tense. It showed up in small ways. At Thanksgiving, when my aunt mentioned seeing my paintings featured in a magazine spread, my mom smiled too tightly and changed the subject to Bianca's new fundraiser. At Christmas, when Lydia unwrapped a sketchbook I'd given her and squealed with excitement, my mom said, "Maybe it's just a phase. Kids move on so fast." I let it roll off me. Mostly. But sometimes, it stuck. Because the truth was, my success didn't fit the narrative they had written for themselves all those years ago. The one where Bianca was the shining star, where I was the quiet afterthought, where art was a cute hobby that eventually withered and made room for real life. I had rewritten that story. And not everyone liked a new ending. It all came to a head, or at least started to, one rainy evening in January. I'd just finished hanging a new set of paintings for a solo show at a small but respected gallery downtown. The gallery owner, Terrence, was an older man with kind eyes and an unshakable belief in local artists. He threw his arms around me when I arrived, beaming. "You're going to sell out again," he said confidently. "Mark my words." I laughed, brushing off the compliment. Success still felt unreal, sometimes like a costume I was trying on but would eventually have to return. The opening night was buzzing. People packed the small space, wine glasses in hand, murmuring about colors and textures and the way this or that painting made them feel. I was in the middle of a conversation with a couple from Savannah, gallery owners themselves, when I saw my family walk in. Judith, Richard, Bianca, Lydia. All dressed neatly, looking slightly out of place among the artsy crowd in their tailored blazers and country club smiles. Judith's eyes flicked around the room quickly, as if scanning for something to be critical of. Bianca spotted me first and waved. Lydia dragged her by the hand toward me. I excused myself from my conversation and met them halfway. "You made it," I said, surprised. Bianca smiled easily. "Of course." Judith hesitated, then leaned in for a brief hug, her perfume sharp and expensive. "This is impressive," she said, glancing around. It sounded stiff. Like a compliment recited from cue cards. Still, I thanked her. Lydia was bouncing on her toes, practically vibrating with excitement. "Which one is your favorite?" she demanded. I laughed. "You'll have to look around and tell me." They wandered the gallery, examining each piece. I tried not to hover, but I couldn't help keeping them in my peripheral vision. At one point, I saw my mother standing in front of one of my larger works, a piece called Inheritance, all deep reds and golds, a girl kneeling beside a broken staircase. She stared at it for a long time. Longer than necessary. Later, when the night was winding down, Bianca came over and nudged me. "You should hear Mom," she said under her breath. "She's been telling everyone she always knew you'd be successful." I snorted. Couldn't help it. Typical. Rewrite history, paint over the inconvenient truths. Still, when Judith approached me later, a glass of champagne in her hand and a practiced smile on her face, I let her speak. "We're very proud of you, Vanessa," she said. "Thank you," I said. "Because at some point, you realize, they're never going to fully understand you. They're never going to undo the years of small wounds. They're never going to see all the invisible versions of yourself that you had to build, alone, just to survive. But you can still survive. You can still succeed. And you can decide every single day which pieces of the past you carry forward, and which ones you leave behind." As I walked them out to their car that night, Judith slipped a small envelope into my hand. "For you," she said, almost shyly. I didn't open it right away. I waited until they were gone, until the gallery was nearly empty, until the lights were dimmed and the last of the guests had wandered off into the rainy Charleston night. Inside the envelope was a card. Simple white stock, gold embossed letters. "Congratulations, Vanessa. You deserve all of this and more. Love, Mom and Dad." No money. No plane tickets. No backhanded comments. Just words. It wasn't everything. But it was something. And sometimes, after a lifetime of fighting to be seen, something is enough. Or at least it's enough to keep going. After the gallery night, things settled into a new kind of normal. My parents started mentioning my work to their friends more often, little humblebrags tucked into conversations like, "Vanessa's doing so well with her art. We always knew she had talent." I didn't correct them. I didn't bother explaining the years they spent discouraging me. If they needed to rewrite history to sleep better at night, that was their burden, not mine. Meanwhile, my career kept growing. By spring, I had been offered a major feature in a Charleston Museum's Southern Contemporary Art exhibit. A huge deal, a permanent piece in a Real museum, not just rotating galleries. I worked harder than I ever had in my life, pouring myself into a piece that told my whole story without needing words: the isolation, the longing, the resilience. I called it Self-Portrait, Inheritance Reclaimed. A girl standing tall in a marsh, storm clouds behind her, holding a brush instead of an umbrella. The day the museum unveiled the new exhibit, they threw a huge gala. Big donors, art critics, local celebrities. It was the kind of event my parents would have done to be part of. And, as it happened, they were invited by me. But not as guests of honor. As guests. No special treatment. No reserved table. No spotlight. I gave my plus ones to Marisol and my gallery owner Terrence, the two people who had actually believed in me from the beginning. Judith and Richard had to sit with the general crowd, just another set of names on the endless RSVP list. I didn't make a scene about it. I didn't snub them to their faces. But they knew. They knew, when they tried to approach me before the ceremony and the museum's director gently steered them away, saying, "I'm sorry, Ms. Marlowe's preparing for her speech right now." They knew, when they saw Marisol standing proudly next to me, wearing the corsage usually reserved for family. They knew, when the spotlight turned to me, only me, and I stood on that stage, microphone trembling slightly in my hand, and gave my speech. I thanked the museum, the artists who came before me, the city of Charleston for nurturing its creative community. I thanked my mentors, my friends, the people who had lifted me up when no one else had. I did not mention my parents. Not once. Not even a sideways reference. Judith sat frozen, her smile slipping slowly from her face as she realized. This was my world now. A world I built without them. When the unveiling happened, and the cloth fell away from the painting, the room gasped. It was massive, almost floor-to-ceiling. This girl with tangled hair and muddy boots, defying the storm behind her, creating her own shelter with nothing but raw determination. I watched as my parents stared up at it, unable to look away. Watched my mom's hand flutter up to her mouth like she was catching a sob. Watched my dad shake his head slightly, as if he couldn't comprehend how this had happened under their noses. The ultimate revenge wasn't cruelty. It wasn't confrontation. It was this. Success. Independence. Wholeness. The fact that I didn't need to punish them, because I had outgrown the need for their approval, and they would have to live with the knowledge that when the world finally saw me, they were the ones who hadn't. After the gala, they approached me as I was gathering my things backstage. Judith's voice cracked slightly as she said, "You were extraordinary tonight." I smiled politely. "Thank you." Richard nodded, silent. They waited, like they expected an invitation to celebrate, to bask, to be pulled back into my light. I didn't offer one. Instead, I excused myself. "Sorry, I'm heading to a private dinner with friends," and walked away without looking back. That night, sitting at a long table surrounded by people who had actually supported me, Marisol, Terrence, a few other artists who had become chosen family, I laughed until my ribs hurt, drank too much champagne, and let the weight of the past fall away like an old, ragged coat. I didn't need to burn bridges. I didn't need to scream or fight or cut them down to size. The most satisfying revenge was this: I had built a life so full, so vibrant, so completely mine they couldn't touch it. They couldn't claim it. They couldn't rewrite it. And they would have to sit in the audience for the rest of their lives, watching the daughter they almost lost shine without them.